Death at the Lavender Manor, or a Miss Marple Mystery. Lavender Manor had never looked more serene than it did that afternoon, when the sun settled warmly over Bramwell Green and bathed the village in a glow so gentle it seemed almost deliberate. The lavender fields behind the manor rolled in orderly purple rows, their scent drifting lazily through open windows and across the clipped lawn. Bees moved with unhurried purpose, and the air carried the comfortable sounds of teacups touching saucers, soft laughter, and the distant toll of the church clock marking the hour. It was the sort of day people remembered fondly later, insisting nothing had seemed amiss. That was always the way of such days. White tables stood beneath fluttering bunting, each one arranged with the precise care that characterized Mrs. Adelaide Hawthorne's approach to life. Everything at Lavender Manor was meant to appear effortless, though anyone who knew her well understood how much control lay beneath that appearance. Guests arrived dressed in their best summer attire, smiling too brightly, eager to be seen, and equally eager not to be noticed for the wrong reasons. Miss Jane Marple had taken her seat at the garden's edge beneath a modest parasol. She wore her pale blue cardigan despite the warmth and held a teacup she allowed to cool between sips. From her position, she could see nearly everything without ever seeming to look directly at anything. Most of the villagers greeted her kindly, then forgot about her almost at once. It was an old habit of theirs and one she found extremely useful. She watched people instead of events. People were far more revealing. Near the refreshment table, Oliver Trent stood with his back rigidly straight, his jacket buttoned despite the heat. As estate manager, he carried himself with a seriousness that suggested the manor's well-being depended entirely upon his vigilance. He spoke in low tones to Clara Finch, Mrs. Hawthorne's secretary, who nodded quickly and glanced over her shoulder more than once. "You're certain everything is prepared?" he asked. "Yes, of course," Clara replied, though her fingers twisted the fabric of her sleeve as she spoke. Mrs. Hawthorne reviewed it herself. "That doesn't always mean it's finished," Oliver said. Clara forced a smile. Nothing ever seems finished to her. Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in the young woman's voice. Nervousness could come from many sources, she reflected, but it rarely appeared without reason. Captain Harold Whitcomb's voice carried across the lawn, booming with practice, confidence, as he recounted yet another story from his military days. The details varied slightly from telling to telling, but the admiration he expected remained constant. A few guests laughed obligingly. Others endured it with patience, learned through years of village gatherings. Margaret Bell, the postmistress, stood nearby with pursed lips, listening only, long enough to roll her eyes when she thought no one important was watching. Miss Marple caught the look easily enough. Across the garden, Daniel Hawthorne leaned against the stone steps leading into the manor. His dark hair was carefully groomed, his suit impeccably cut, yet he looked distinctly ill at ease. He kept glancing toward the house, then away again, as though bracing himself for an encounter he both anticipated and dreaded. When Mrs. Adelaide Hawthorne finally emerged, conversation softened instinctively. She moved with practiced elegance, lavender silk whispering as she descended the steps. Pearls rested perfectly at her throat. Her gaze swept the guests, not warmly, but appraisingly, noting who had come, who had not, and who might require correction later. She spoke with the crisp assurance of someone accustomed to being heard. The applause that followed was polite rather than enthusiastic, but it satisfied her well enough. For a time afterward, the fete proceeded exactly as intended. Tea was poured. Cakes were praised. Compliments were exchanged with careful moderation. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Hawthorne closely when her attention turned briefly toward her nephew. Something tightened in the older woman's expression, no more than a flicker, but unmistakable. Recognition passed between them, accompanied by something colder beneath it. Then, without warning, the calm fractured. The scream erupted from inside the manor, slicing through music and conversation alike. It was sharp, raw, and unmistakably human. Several guests gasped. Someone dropped a cup. For a moment, no one moved at all, as if the sound itself had stunned them into stillness. Then chaos followed. Men rushed toward the open doors. Women clutched one another. Voices overlapped with speculation and alarm. Miss Marple remained where she was for a few seconds longer, allowing the initial frenzy to pass before rising carefully from her chair. Inside the drawing room, the scene resolved itself into something dreadful and permanent. Mrs. Adelaide Hawthorne lay on the carpet near her writing desk, her body twisted awkwardly. One arm bent beneath her in a way that suggested no living movement. Her pearl necklace had snapped, the beads scattered across the rug as though flung there in accusation. The scent of lavender polish hung heavily in the air, undercut by something faintly metallic. Clara Finch stood near the doorway, her face drained of color. "I only came to fetch the ledger," she said, her words tumbling over one another. She didn't answer when I knocked. I thought perhaps she'd fainted. No one answered her at once. Daniel Hawthorne stared at the body without blinking, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. Oliver Trent hovered near the desk, his gaze fixed not on the dead woman but on the open drawer beside her. Captain Whitcomb spoke in an urgent whisper to anyone who would listen, repeating the same phrases again and again, as if sound itself might restore order. Miss Marple positioned herself just behind the others, unseen and unremarked. She noted the overturned chair, the half-written note upon the desk, the drawer left ajar. But what held her attention most was Mrs. Hawthorne's expression. It was not one of fear, nor surprise. It was the look of someone who had seen precisely who stood before her. A doctor was summoned from the village, though even before his arrival, the truth had settled over the room with unmistakable weight. When he finally rose from his examination, his face confirmed what everyone already suspected. "She has been dead for some time," he said quietly. This was not a natural passing. The word murder was not spoken at once, but it seemed to hang in the air all the same, heavy and unavoidable. Outside, laughter had ceased entirely. Guests clustered in uneasy groups, whispering behind gloved hands. The lavender continued to sway gently in the breeze, oblivious to the shift that had taken place within the manor walls. Miss Marple returned to a nearby chair and folded her hands in her lap. Around her, suspicion had already begun its subtle work, reshaping glances and altering familiar faces. She gazed out through the window at the purple fields beyond, her expression mild, almost detached. In her long experience, tragedy rarely arrived without warning. It merely waited patiently for the moment when everyone believed themselves safest. And in villages like Bramwell Green, safety was often the most dangerous illusion of all. By evening, Bramwell Green no longer felt like the same village it had been that morning. The lanes were still narrow, the cottages still neat, yet something invisible had shifted, like a draft creeping beneath a closed door. Word traveled faster than any official announcement ever could. By the time the constable finished taking names at Lavender Manor, nearly everyone in the village already knew that Mrs. Adelaide Hawthorne was dead. People gathered in doorways and at garden gates, lowering their voices, as though the lavender fields themselves might overhear. The murder was discussed in fragments and half-certainties, each retelling, sharpening the story according to the speaker's temperament. Some insisted she must have been robbed. Others were convinced it was a family matter. More than a few spoke as though they had always known such a thing would happen one day, though none could say precisely why. Miss Marple returned to her small guest room at the vicarage that evening, having accepted the offer of lodging with quiet gratitude. From her window, she could see the path leading past the churchyard where villagers paused longer than usual, their faces drawn with unease. She sat with her knitting in her lap, though the needles remained still, and listened as voices drifted faintly through the open air. It was extraordinary, she reflected, how tragedy gave people permission to say aloud what they had thought silently for years. At supper, the vicar's wife spoke in careful tones, her words arranged politely around a core of unmistakable curiosity. "Of course, Mrs. Hawthorne had her ways," she said, buttering her bread with deliberate calm. "One can't deny she was firm. Firm was one word for it. Miss Marple smiled faintly and said nothing. Elsewhere in the village, the theories multiplied. At the post office, Margaret Bell leaned across the counter to whisper that it must surely have been Daniel Hawthorne. He needed money. Everyone knew that. He lived well beyond his allowance, and Mrs. Hawthorne had been heard more than once threatening to revise her will. Margaret spoke with the satisfaction of someone finally allowed to voice a long-standing dislike. At the Crown and Thistle pub, Captain Whitcomb held court once more, insisting that such crimes always followed patterns. Disgruntled staff, he declared, tapping his glass. Always the staff. They know the house. They know the routines. His audience nodded, emboldened by ale and certainty. Across the room, Oliver. Trent sat stiff-backed and silent, nursing a drink he scarcely touched. When someone mentioned his name too openly, he excused himself and left without finishing it. Clara Finch did not appear anywhere that evening. It was said she had taken to her room at Lavender Manor, too shaken to speak to anyone. Some pitied her, others found her distress suspiciously convenient. By the next morning, official authority arrived in the form of Inspector Lionel Graves, a tall man with a lined face, and the habit of listening with his eyes narrowed slightly, as though the world were perpetually out of focus. He spoke to the villagers individually, gathering impressions as much as statements. People were eager to assist him. Nothing made one feel more important than being consulted by the police. Miss Marple observed these conversations from a distance. She noticed how stories shifted subtly depending on who was listening, how pauses lengthened when certain names were mentioned, how certainty hardened around conjecture, until it sounded remarkably like fact. At Lavender Manor, the atmosphere had grown brittle. Curtains were drawn. Doors closed softly. Even the servants moved with exaggerated care, as though the house itself might break if handled roughly. Inspector Graves questioned Daniel Hawthorne in the morning light of the drawing room. The young man answered politely enough, though his impet showed in small gestures, the tightening of his fingers, the way his gaze drifted toward the window. My aunt and I disagreed, he admitted, frequently, but that hardly makes me a murderer. Graves inclined his head. It establishes motive, Mr. Hawthorne. Daniel's mouth thinned. If disagreement were motive enough, half the village would be guilty. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively nearby, thought that an entirely accurate observation. Clara Finch's interview followed. She spoke haltingly, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles whitened. She described her employer as demanding but fair, strict but principled. It sounded rehearsed, though not necessarily dishonest. When asked about the moment she discovered the body, her composure cracked slightly, and she began again from the beginning, repeating details almost word for word. Inspector Graves made notes. Oliver Trent was more guarded. He emphasized his loyalty, his years of service, his sense of duty to the manor. He denied any knowledge of conflict, though his eyes flicked toward the desk drawer when he thought no one noticed. By noon, whispers had already begun to align around a single conclusion. Daniel Hawthorne, the spoiled nephew with financial troubles, made an appealing villain. His arguments with his aunt were well known. His presence at the manor was convenient. The village seemed almost relieved to settle upon him. Miss Marple watched this development with gentle concern. Villagers were remarkably fond of simple answers, particularly when those answers allowed them to preserve their own innocence. She took a slow walk through the garden later that afternoon, passing the lavender rose that still released their fragrance when brushed. Several villagers greeted her, eager to share their opinions now that events had elevated everyone into an amateur detective. "It's obvious, isn't it?" one woman said. "Poor Mrs. Hawthorne, she must have finally refused him." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "People rarely do things for only one reason," she replied. The woman laughed politely, clearly missing the point. As the day wore on, Inspector Graves grew increasingly confident. Evidence, such as it was, seemed to favor the nephew. Circumstance, motive, opportunity all tidy and convenient. By evening his questions became narrower, more pointed. Miss Marple, however, felt a small unease settle within her. It was not what people were saying that troubled her. It was what they avoided saying altogether. She recalled the way Clara Finch's hands twisted when speaking of the guest ledger. The way Oliver Trent watched the desk rather than the body. The peculiar calm on Mrs. Hawthorne's face in death, as though recognition had preceded fear. Most of all, she thought of how quickly the village had chosen whom to blame. Human nature, she knew, preferred certainty over truth. And certainty, when embraced too quickly, had a habit of concealing far more than it revealed. The following morning unfolded beneath a sky washed thin and pale, as though even the weather hesitated to commit itself. Bramwell Green stirred more quietly than usual. Doors opened later. Curtains remained half-drawn. The routines that had once anchored the village now felt tentative, performed out of habit rather than comfort. Miss Marple rose early and took her breakfast at the vicarage table while the house remained still. She listened to the ticking clock and allowed her thoughts to settle, not on the crime itself, but on the people surrounding it. Experience had taught her that violence was rarely born in isolation. It emerged from patterns small, repeated frictions that others dismissed as ordinary. Later that morning, she made her way toward Lavender Manor, walking at an unhurried pace. She paused occasionally, greeting neighbors or admiring flowers, her progress slow enough to appear aimless. In truth, she absorbed far more than anyone suspected. Near the green, she encountered Margaret Bell, who was rearranging newspapers in the post office window with unnecessary vigor. "Such a terrible business," Margaret said at once, clearly eager to speak. "I still say it was bound to happen. Mrs. Hawthorne made enemies wherever she went, did she?" Miss Marple asked gently. Margaret sniffed. "Well, she never let anyone forget their place." Miss Marple thanked her and continued on, reflecting that cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived wrapped in propriety. At the manor gates, Inspector Graves was already present, speaking with a uniformed constable. He greeted Miss Marple politely. If without particular interest, elderly ladies were not generally considered investigative assets. Inside, the house felt altered. Without Mrs. Hawthorne's presence, the rooms seemed strangely unanchored, as though the furniture itself waited for instructions that would never come. Sunlight fell across the drawing-room carpet, illuminating the scattered pearls that had not yet been removed. No one seemed willing to touch them. Miss Marple paused near the writing desk, studying it with mild curiosity. The drawer remained open, its contents partly visible. Letters lay inside, neatly bundled with ribbon alongside a small leather-bound notebook. "May I?" she asked softly. Inspector Graves hesitated, then nodded. "As long as you don't disturb anything." She leaned forward only slightly, not touching, merely observing. The notebook, its edge was worn from frequent handling. Not sentimental wear, she thought, but practical. Something consulted often. Nearby, Oliver Trent hovered under the pretense of supervising the staff. When he noticed Miss Marple's gaze, his shoulders stiffened. "She kept meticulous records," he said quickly. Miss Hawthorne believed in documentation. "A sensible habit," Miss Marple replied, "especially for someone who didn't trust easily." Oliver's lips tightened. "She trusted me." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Did she?" The question lingered longer than either of them expected. Clara Finch appeared in the doorway shortly afterward, her face pale but composed. She carried a stack of papers held so tightly they bent at the corners. "I was asked to bring these," she said, setting them on a side table. Her eyes flicked toward the desk, then away again. Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You must have worked very closely with Mrs. Hawthorne." Clara nodded. "Every day. That can be both a privilege and a burden." A flicker crossed the young woman as face relief perhaps at being understood. "She expected excellence," Clara said. "All the time." "Did she reward it?" Miss Marple asked. Clara hesitated. Sometime. Inspector Graves cleared his throat, signaling the end of the exchange. Clara withdrew at once, her footsteps quickening as she left. Later, Daniel Hawthorne was brought in again for further questioning. His patience had thinned overnight. He paced as he spoke, anger creeping into his voice despite his attempts at control. "She was going to cut me off," he admitted finally. "Yes, we argued about it. But I didn't kill her." "Where were you at the time of her death?" Graves asked. "Outside, on the terrace. Half the village saw me, several had in fact." Miss Marple recalled noticing him there, restless and distracted. After Daniel left, Inspector Graves rubbed his temples. "Everyone has something to hide," he muttered. "But not everything is murder." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite true." She wandered toward the back corridor where servants moved quietly about their duties. There she encountered Mrs. Potter, the housekeeper, whose loyalty to her late employer bordered on reverence. She was a strong woman, Mrs. Potter said, eyes shining. "But strong women make people uncomfortable." "They do indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Did she seem troubled recently?" The housekeeper hesitated. She'd been watchful, asking questions, checking old matters. "What sort of matters?" Mrs. Potter shook her head. "I couldn't say, but she didn't sleep well toward the end." Miss Marple thanked her and continued on, the small comment settling heavily in her thoughts. That afternoon she sat once more in the garden, knitting as villagers passed. Some offered sympathetic smiles, others looked at her as though she might be collecting information, which of course she was just not in the way they imagined. She considered the patterns emerging around her. Not facts, precisely, but absences. The things people avoided mentioning, the topics that silenced conversation. Mrs. Hawthorne had been preparing for something. That much was clear. She had been reviewing records, questioning routines, perhaps uncovering truths long buried beneath order and respectability, and someone had known. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked. It was rarely the loud disputes that led to murder, she reflected. Far more often, it was the quiet panic of exposure, the moment when a carefully constructed life threatened to unravel. As the sun lowered behind the lavender fields, she gazed toward the manor with calm, thoughtful eyes. People believed the truth announced itself boldly. In her experience, it almost never did. By the third day, certainty had settled over Bramwell Green with remarkable speed. It clung to conversations and glances alike, a shared understanding that required no announcement. People no longer spoke in theories but in conclusion. Daniel Hawthorne's name surfaced again and again, spoken with the calm assurance reserved for truths everyone agreed upon. Miss Marple noticed the change at once. Where earlier whispers had carried curiosity, they now carried relief. Relief that danger could be neatly contained within a single person, preferably one already viewed as troublesome. The village returned to its routines with cautious optimism, as though identifying a culprit restored order. At Lavender Manor, Inspector Graves' attention narrowed visibly. Daniel was questioned repeatedly, each interview more pointed than the last. The young man's frustration sharpened his words, which did little to help his cause. "You're not listening," he snapped during one exchange. "You've already decided." Graves' tone remained polite but firm. "Evidence has a way of pointing in certain directions, or being pushed," Daniel muttered. Miss Marple observed from her quiet corner, noting how Daniel's defensiveness was interpreted as guilt. Few people understood how easily fear could mimic it. That afternoon, she found herself seated beside Margaret Bell during tea at the vicarage. Margaret leaned closer, voice lowered with conspiratorial confidence. "They say the inspector will make an arrest soon," she whispered. "About time, if you ask me." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "It must be comforting to know who did it." Margaret frowned slightly. "Well, it stands to reason, does it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Margaret hesitated, then laughed. "You always say the strangest thing." At the manor, Oliver Trent had grown noticeably more composed now that suspicion lay elsewhere. He resumed issuing instructions with renewed authority, correcting minor inefficiencies with unnecessary precision. His relief showed in the straightening of his posture. the steadiness of his gaze. Clara Finch, by contrast, seemed to fade further into herself. She avoided common rooms and spoke only when addressed directly. Miss Marple encountered her late one afternoon in the corridor near the study. "You must be exhausted," Miss Marple said kindly. Clara managed a faint smile. "I'll be glad when it's all over." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "So many people feel that way." The words lingered between them. Clara's eyes flickered, as though she might say more, but footsteps approached and she hurried away. Later that evening, Inspector Graves announced that Daniel Hawthorne would be formally detained for further questioning in the nearby town. The news spread quickly. Some villagers nodded with grim satisfaction. Others expressed regret that such unpleasantness had come so close to home. Miss Marple listened quietly. She found herself unsettled not by what was happening, but by how easy it seemed. Nothing in the house had been disturbed beyond the drawing room. No sign of struggle beyond the overturned chair. No clear explanation for how Mrs. Hawthorne had been killed, only assumptions built upon motive and opportunity. She returned once more to the writing desk, requesting permission to sit nearby while the room was otherwise empty. Inspector Graves allowed it with a shrug. There seemed little harm in indulging an elderly lady's curiosity. The half-written note lay where it had always been, ink-dried mid-sentence. Miss Marple leaned closer, reading carefully. It was not a farewell, nor a will. It was a reminder. Names, dates, small annotations in the margin. She did not need to read the full content to understand its purpose. Mrs. Hawthorne had been preparing to confront someone. Not emotionally, but administratively. The language was precise, methodical. Someone had known what was coming. Miss Marple glanced at the open drawer again. Several letters were missing from the otherwise orderly bundle. Their absence spoke louder than their presence ever could. That evening, as twilight deepened, the manor settled into uneasy quiet. Daniel was escorted away, his protests echoing briefly before fading down the drive. Some servants watched from the windows. Others avoided looking at all. Miss Marple remained seated in the drawing room, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. Inspector Graves paused near her. "You seem troubled, Miss Marple." "Only thoughtful," she replied. He smiled faintly. "We believe we're close to resolution." She returned his smile gently. "I hope you are correct." Yet, as he left, her gaze returned to the scattered pearls still resting on the carpet. They had broken outward, she realized, not inward. The necklace had been pulled from behind, not snapped in front, a small detail easily overlooked. She rose slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the lavender fields darkened beneath the encroaching night, their fragrance stronger in the cooling air. Villages, she reflected, had long memories. Secrets could sleep peacefully for decades until disturbed, and when disturbed, they rarely allowed themselves to be buried again so neatly. Miss Marple folded her hands and waited, certain that truth, like human nature itself, resisted being rushed. With Daniel Hawthorne removed from the manor, Lavender Manor fell into a strained calm that fooled no one. The servants performed their duties with mechanical precision, yet every sound seemed too loud, every pause too long. The house no longer felt occupied so much as watched, as though memory itself lingered in the corridors. Miss Marple continued her quiet routines, walking the gardens in the morning and sitting in the drawing room during the afternoon, her presence so unobtrusive that it was often forgotten entirely. And yet, as tensions loosened, words began to slip free. Mrs. Potter, the housekeeper, spoke first, though not intentionally. It happened while she polished a sideboard already gleaming. She had started asking again, Mrs. Potter said suddenly, not looking up. "Asking?" Miss Marple prompted gently about the old accounts. From years back, before Mr. Hawthorne died, she paused, lips tightening. She said something didn't balance. Did she mention what troubled her? Mrs. Potter shook her head. Only that someone had been careless with trust. Those were her words. Carelessness, Miss Marple thought, was rarely accidental. Later that day, Oliver Trent was less guarded than usual. With Daniel gone, he spoke more freely, even allowing irritation to show. "I warned her," he said during an exchange about estate matters. "Digging into old business does no good. It unsettles people." "Truth often does," Miss Marple replied. He frowned. "Some things are better left where they are." "That depends," she said mildly, "on whom they protect." He did not answer. In the village, gossip shifted again. Without Daniel Trent, conversations grew more speculative. Some began to wonder whether he had truly acted alone. Others spoke of the manor itself, of strange tensions that had existed long before the murder. At the post office, Margaret Bell confided that Mrs. Hawthorne had once dismissed a maid without explanation, paying her generously to leave the village altogether. No one could recall her name, only that she vanished quickly. At the pub, Captain Whitcomb mentioned a dispute years earlier, involving estate funds earmarked for village improvements that had quietly disappeared. He laughed as he told it, as though the matter had always seemed too dull to pursue. Miss Marple listened. Patterns emerged not from what people said, but from how often the same periods of time resurfaced. Always the years shortly after Mr. Hawthorne's death, always accounts, permissions, signatures. One afternoon, Clara Finch approached Miss Marple in the garden. She looked thinner, her composure worn down by sleepless nights. "I don't think Daniel did it," she said abruptly. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "That is a brave thing to say." Clara swallowed. "Mrs. Hawthorne was planning something. She told me not to schedule any visitors after the fete. She said she needed privacy." "Did she say why?" "No," Clara admitted. "But she locked certain files in the study afterward, ones she usually kept accessible." "Did anyone else know?" Clara hesitated. "Mr. Trent may have seen her. He questioned me about it." Miss Marple thanked her, watching as relief flickered across the young woman's face. Sometimes simply being heard eased a burden. That evening, Inspector Graves reviewed the case notes with growing frustration. The evidence against Daniel remained circumstantial. Nothing concrete tied him to the act itself. He confided as much aloud in the drawing room, unaware Miss Marple was listening from her chair. "She was poisoned," he said finally. "A slow-acting substance. Administered earlier than we thought." Miss Marple's knitting stilled, which means, Graves continued, the timing at the fete was a coincidence, or a convenience, she thought. Poison required planning, access, patience. It also required confidence that discovery would come later, not sooner. Miss Marple considered Mrs. Hawthorne's final expression again, that look of recognition. A poisoner would not need confrontation at the moment of death, yet Mrs. Hawthorne had clearly recognized someone present. Unless she had recognized intention, not action. The following morning, Miss Marple requested to see the kitchen ledger, under the guise of helping Mrs. Potter recall recent menus. The meals before the fete had been ordinary enough, but one detail stood out. A special lavender cordial had been prepared at Mrs. Hawthorne's request. She alone had been drinking it. "Did you taste it?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Potter shook her head. She said it was medicinal, said it helped her nerves. "Who prepared it?" Mrs. Potter frowned. "Mr. Trent arranged the ingredients, but Miss Finch brewed it. Mrs. Hawthorne trusted her handwriting more than anyone's." Miss Marple thanked her and returned to the garden, mind quietly alight. Trust. Records, old accounts, people rarely murdered for hatred alone. Far more often, they killed to preserve something already stolen. That afternoon, she found Oliver Trent again near the study. His composure slipped when she mentioned the cordial. "I only sourced herbs," he said stiffly. "Nothing harmful." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "Poisons are rarely labeled as such." He turned away sharply. As evening settled, she sat beneath the lavender-scented air and reflected on the web forming around her. Mrs. Hawthorne had uncovered financial wrongdoing, something long concealed and recently vulnerable. She had intended to confront the responsible party after the fete when privacy allowed, The poison ensured she never could, and the necklace broken from behind suggested not rage but urgency. A moment of realization, a struggle not of strength but of shock. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Someone had panicked, and panic, she knew, always betrayed itself eventually. The revelation that poison had been involved altered the atmosphere of Bramwell Green in subtle but unmistakable ways. Fear, once directed outward toward a single suspect, now turned inward. People grew cautious with their words, with their meals, even with one another. Trust, so easily assumed in small villages, began to fray. Miss Marple noticed how quickly kindness became calculation. At breakfast tables and garden gates, conversations stalled when someone approached too closely. Teacups were rinsed twice. Doors were locked at night for the first time in years. The knowledge that the murderer had not acted in passion but with forethought unsettled everyone far more than violence ever could. Inspector Graves expanded his inquiries, returning to questions previously dismissed. He asked again about routines, about who had access to the kitchen, the study, the storerooms. Each interview reopened old discomforts. Oliver Trent responded with growing irritation. "You're chasing ghosts," he snapped during one exchange. "The man responsible is already in custody." "Poison doesn't respect convenience," Graves replied evenly. Clara Finch became increasingly withdrawn. When questioned, she answered precisely but without warmth, as though guarding herself against saying too much or too little. Miss Marple observed that she avoided eye contact whenever the old accounts were mentioned. One afternoon, the quiet was broken by a disturbance near the garden shed. A maid discovered a small glass bottle hidden behind stacked pots. Its label faded nearly to illegibility. The constable summoned Inspector Graves at once. The bottle smelled faintly herbal, with an undercurrent sharp enough to sting the nose. "Looks like tincture," Graves murmured, possibly added to the cordial. The discovery sent fresh shockwaves through the village. For some, it confirmed that Daniel must have prepared the poison earlier and hidden it for later use. For others, it suggested something far more troubling, that someone still free had attempted to dispose of evidence. Miss Marple examined the bottle from a polite distance. The residue inside clung unevenly to the glass, suggesting it had been washed hastily rather than emptied naturally. "A careless hiding place," she observed quietly. Graves glanced at her. "Careless people often make mistakes." "Or frightened ones," she replied. That evening, Clara Finch was found in tears in the study, clutching a stack of documents. When questioned, she admitted she had been organizing old correspondence at Mrs. Hawthorne's instructions shortly before the fate. She said there were discrepancies. Clara whispered that funds had been redirected years ago under her husband's authorization, but she believed the signature had been forged. Inspector Graves leaned forward. "Forged by whom?" Clara hesitated. She never said, but the handwriting matched mine. The room fell silent. Miss Marple felt the moment sharpen like glass. Clara's distress appeared genuine, but truth did not always align neatly with innocence. "It wasn't me," Clara insisted. "Those letters were copied from originals. She asked me to transcribe them years ago." "Who provided the originals?" Graves asked. Clara shook her head helplessly. "Mr. Trent. He handled all archival materials." When Oliver Trent was confronted, his composure fractured for the first time. Anger flared quickly, too quickly. "Ridiculous," he snapped. "You're accusing me of theft now, only of knowledge," Graves replied. Trent's face reddened. "I managed that estate flawlessly." Miss Marple watched him carefully, noted how he spoke of the estate rather than Mrs. Hawthorne. Loyalty to structure, not to people. Later that night, another disturbance occurred. A fire broke out in the Manor's old storage room. It was contained quickly, little more than smoke damage, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Several boxes of financial records were destroyed before anyone could intervene. Graves stood amid the soot, jaw tight. Someone's trying to erase the past. Miss Marple nodded gently, which suggests the past is very dangerous indeed. Suspicion surged anew, shifting wildly. Some whispered that Clara had attempted to destroy evidence implicating herself. Others believed Oliver Trent had panicked upon realizing the investigation was widening. Even Captain Whitcomb was briefly questioned, his bluster faltering under scrutiny. The village had lost its certainty entirely. Miss Marple, however, felt clarity beginning to form. The poison, she believed, had not been administered during the fete at all. Mrs. Hawthorne had already been dying when she entered the garden that afternoon. The collapse inside the manor had merely been the final stage, which meant the confrontation she had anticipated never truly occurred, except in her mind. Someone had realized she knew, and acted before she could speak. Miss Marple revisited the detail of the pearls, broken from behind, yes, but not violently, as though a hand had caught the necklace unintentionally. Startled by Mrs. Hawthorne's sudden recognition, a meeting interrupted, not a murder in rage, a moment of exposure. As dusk settled once more over Bramwell Green, Miss Marple sat quietly near the garden path. She listened to footsteps pass and voices murmur beyond hedges. The killer, she was certain now, was not the person most feared, but the one most desperate, and desperation, like poison, seeped through every carefully maintained surface eventually. By now, the village existed in a state of suspended breath. No one spoke openly of innocence anymore. The question was no longer who could have done it, but who would break first. Fear had replaced gossip, and where fear lived, mistakes followed closely behind. Miss Marple felt the change most keenly in people's silences. At breakfast tables, conversation stalled mid-sentence. In the lanes, villagers passed one another with polite smiles that dissolved the moment backs were turned. Even the lavender fields seemed subdued, their scent heavy rather than pleasant, clinging to the air as though unwilling to drift away. Inspector Graves remained at the manor late into the evenings now. He reread statements, compared timelines, and paced the drawing room with the restless intensity of a man aware that truth hovered nearby yet remained just beyond reach. Evidence pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. Miss Marple watched patiently. She had learned long ago that truth rarely emerged under direct pressure. It revealed itself through reaction, not confession. That afternoon, she requested tea be served in the small sitting room overlooking the garden, a room Mrs. Hawthorne had favored when she wished to speak privately. Graves consented without hesitation. By now, he regarded Miss Marple with a mixture of curiosity and reluctant respect. Only 3 others were present: Oliver Trent, Clara Finch, and Mrs. Potter. The gathering appeared entirely innocent, arranged under the pretense of calming nerves, yet the tension beneath it was unmistakable. Miss Marple spoke pleasantly about the weather, about the stubbornness of lavender plants in cooler seasons. Her tone was light, almost meandering. She allowed pauses to stretch, comfortable in their discomfort. "It's remarkable," she said at last, "how Mrs. Hawthorne managed so much alone after her husband passed. Finances, staff, correspondence, a heavy burden." Oliver Trent nodded stiffly. She insisted on it. Still, Miss Marple continued, even the most capable people rely on others, especially when ruggles become complicated. Clara's teacup trembled slightly against its saucer. Miss Marple noticed, but did not look directly at her. "Old accounts can be terribly confusing," she went on, "particularly when signatures resemble one another." At that, Oliver Trent's hand tightened around his cup. Mrs. Potter shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple's voice remained mild. Miss Hawthorne confided once quite casually that she had discovered a long-standing irregularity. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "Just something that did not align with her late husband's habits." Inspector Graves looked up sharply. "She mentioned this to you?" he asked. "Only in passing," Miss Marple replied. She wondered aloud who might feel most threatened if such an error came to light. Silence followed. Then Oliver Trent spoke, too quickly. "Surely you don't mean—" "I mean nothing at all," Miss Marple said gently. "I merely observe." She allowed her gaze to rest briefly on the garden beyond the window. She planned to address it after the fete, Miss Marple added. She believed confronting matters calmly, face to face. Clara's breath caught audibly. Miss Marple turned to her at last. "You were asked to prepare certain documents that day, were you not?" Clara nodded faintly. "Yes, and you brought them to the study shortly before the fete." "Yes." "Did Mrs. Hawthorne seem anxious?" "She seemed resolved." Oliver stood abruptly. "This is speculation." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Speculation becomes uncomfortable only when it approaches truth." His composure fractured then, not explosively but subtly. A flush crept up his neck. His jaw worked as though he were choosing between silence and speech. Graves leaned forward. "Mr. Trent?" Oliver exhaled sharply. She was mistaken. The accounts were approved. Everything was authorized by a signature she believed forged, Graves said. "By a signature identical to Miss Finch's," Oliver snapped. Clara stared at him in shock. Miss Marple spoke softly. "You taught her to copy handwriting, did you not?" Oliver froze. "You encouraged it," Miss Marple continued. "You needed someone capable of replicating documents convincingly. And years ago, when Mrs. Hawthorne's husband was ill, oversight was minimal." Graves rose slowly. "You redirected funds." Oliver laughed once harshly. "For the estate." "For yourself," Graves corrected. The truth unraveled rapidly after that. Oliver confessed not immediately but inevitably. He had skimmed modest amounts over years, always just enough to escape notice. When Mrs. Hawthorne began reviewing records, panic set in. He could not destroy everything at once without drawing suspicion, but poisoning her slowly bought time. The lavender cordial had been his suggestion, a harmless tonic, he claimed. Clara had brewed it under instruction, unaware of its alteration. The fire had been his final attempt to erase proof. As he spoke, his voice grew hollow. "I never meant for her to suffer." Miss Marple's gaze softened. Few ever do. When he was taken away, the manor seemed to exhale for the first time since the murder. Clara wept openly now, her relief mingling with shame. Mrs. Potter crossed herself quietly. Inspector Graves approached Miss Marple afterward. "You saw it long before I did." She shook her head. "I merely noticed what others overlooked. Fear leaves fingerprints everywhere." Outside, the lavender stirred gently once more, its fragrance lightened by evening air, and within Bramwell Green, the truth at last had found its voice. The days that followed unfolded with a peculiar mixture of relief and unease. With Oliver Trent removed from Lavender Manor, the house felt strangely hollow, as though it were adjusting to the absence of yet another authority figure. The servants moved more freely now, yet spoke less, each aware that the walls had once kept secrets and might still. Inspector Graves remained for several days to complete formalities. His presence was quieter than before, no longer charged with urgency, but the village did not immediately return to its former rhythm. Trust, once fractured, required patience to mend. Miss Marple observed these changes with gentle attentiveness. Clara Finch kept to herself at first, burdened by the knowledge that her skills had been used for wrongdoing, however unwittingly. When she finally ventured into the garden one afternoon, she looked as though she had aged years in a matter of days. "I keep thinking I should have known," she said, sitting beside Miss Marple beneath the lavender-scented air. "It is very difficult to recognize wrongdoing when it hides behind routine," Miss Marple replied. "Evil is rarely theatrical. It prefers respectability." Clara nodded slowly. "Mrs. Hawthorne trusted me. I failed her." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand over hers. "You were trusted because you were honest. That is not failure." In the village, reactions varied. Some spoke openly of shame for having rushed to judgment. Others insisted they had always suspected Oliver Trent, though none could quite recall saying so aloud before. Human memory, Miss Marple reflected, was remarkably flexible when dignity required it. Daniel Hawthorne was released within days. He returned thinner, quieter, and deeply changed. When he walked through the village, people greeted him awkwardly, unsure whether apology or silence was more appropriate. He encountered Miss Marple near the churchyard late one afternoon. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. She smiled kindly. "You needn't. Truth tends to thank itself." He hesitated. "I suppose I never truly knew my aunt." "Few people ever do," Miss Marple said. "Not entirely." Lavender Manor began the slow process of reorganization. Mrs. Hawthorne's meticulous records were reviewed, restored where possible, and preserved with care. What remained of her work revealed a woman far more vigilant than many had realized, one who had suspected betrayal long before anyone else dared to. In the evenings, Miss Marple sat by the vicarage window, watching the village lights glow softly in the dusk. She reflected not on the crime itself, but on the patterns it had exposed. Respectability had shielded Oliver Trent for years. Familiarity had protected him even more. People trusted what they believed they understood. Inspector Graves visited her once more before departing. "I hope you'll forgive me," he said, "but I underestimated you." Miss Marple smiled. "That is quite all right. Most people do," he laughed softly. "You have an extraordinary way of seeing things. I've simply spent a lifetime watching people behave badly in very small ways," she replied. "The larger ones follow naturally." When he left, the village finally seemed to relax. Children resumed playing in the lanes. Doors stood open again. Conversations drifted back toward harvests and weather. Yet something had changed. The knowledge lingered that kindness could mask desperation, and that evil did not always announce itself with raised voices or violent hands. Miss Marple took one last walk through the lavender fields before her departure. The flowers were beginning to fade, their color softened by time, yet their scent remained. She paused and breathed it in. Human nature, she thought, was much the same, outwardly delicate, capable of sweetness, and when crushed, capable of revealing truths far stronger than anyone expected. In the quiet that followed the investigation's end, Bramwell Green attempted to reclaim its sense of normality. The attempt was earnest, though imperfect. Familiar routines returned cautiously, like birds after a storm, uncertain whether the danger had truly passed. Windows were opened again. Laughter resumed at the pub, though it came more softly now, as if people feared tempting fate. Miss Marple remained a little while longer, not out of necessity but habit. She had learned that the aftermath of violence often revealed as much about human nature as the act itself. Lavender Manor stood subdued yet dignified, its rooms cleaned and restored, though traces of absence lingered stubbornly. The pearls had been gathered at last and placed in a small velvet box. Mrs. Hawthorne's desk remained untouched, her final papers arranged neatly as though waiting for her return. Daniel Hawthorne visited the manor one afternoon accompanied by Clara Finch. Their presence together would once have drawn gossip. Now it drew only quiet observation. "I think she would have wanted the accounts settled properly," Daniel said, standing in the study. Clara nodded. She cared deeply about order. Miss Marple, seated nearby, said gently, she cared about fairness. The distinction mattered. Word arrived that Oliver Trent had confessed fully. The village reacted with predictable astonishment, followed swiftly by retrospective certainty. Many claimed they had sensed something amiss all along. Miss Marple listened politely and offered no contradiction. It was rarely kind to challenge people's revised memories. Mrs. Potter busied herself restoring the manor's rhythms. She reopened long-closed cupboards, aired forgotten linens, and insisted upon fresh flowers each morning. It was her way of mourning through usefulness. She would have approved, she said once, arranging a vase near the window. Miss Marple believed she was right. The villagers spoke often now of Mrs. Hawthorne's strength, though few mentioned the loneliness that must have accompanied it. Authority, she reflected, created distance even when it commanded respect. One evening, Clara visited Miss Marple at the vicarage. "I've been offered another position," she said hesitantly, "in a larger town. That sounds promising. I'm not sure I'm ready to leave." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Staying can be braver than going, but so can beginning again." Clara breathed out slowly. "You make it sound possible." "It always is," Miss Marple said. As her departure approached, Miss Marple packed her small suitcase with familiar care. The village gathered to see her off in understated fashion, handshakes, warm smiles, and expressions of gratitude delivered with a hint of embarrassment. At the station platform, Daniel Hawthorne waited to say goodbye. "I hope Bramwell Green will be remembered for something other than this," he said. "It will," Miss Marple replied. "Villagers have remarkable resilience. They forget selectively." The train arrived with a gentle hiss. As she took her seat by the window, she watched the familiar shapes of the village recede, the church spire, the hedgerows, the lavender fields fading into distance. She reflected on Mrs. Hawthorne's final days, on the quiet courage it took to face betrayal without spectacle. Not everyone fought with raised voices. Some simply prepared the truth and trusted it would surface in time. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly as the train began to move. Justice, she knew, was not always loud. Often it arrived gently, guided by patience and attention, and sometimes it came disguised as an elderly woman who listened when others spoke and believed people when they showed her who they truly were. The village gathered once more in the drawing room of Lavender Manor, though this time the atmosphere was markedly different. There was no frantic urgency, no sharp fear tightening every breath. Instead, a quiet expectancy settled over the group, heavy but controlled, though everyone sensed that something unfinished still hovered among them. Miss Marple sat near the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating dust motes drifting lazily in the air. The room looked almost peaceful again, which struck her as faintly ironic. Peace, she had learned, was often most convincing just after turmoil. Inspector Graves stood near the fireplace, reviewing his notes, though he no longer truly needed them. Daniel Hawthorne lingered near the doorway, uncertain whether he belonged there at all. Clara Finch sat stiffly on the edge of a chair, her composure regained but fragile. Mrs. Potter stood behind her, hands clasped, resolute in her quiet loyalty. At Graves's request, Miss Marple had agreed to explain matters not because the case required it legally, but because people required it emotionally. Understanding, she knew, was how wounds closed. It began, she said softly, long before the day of the fete. Her voice carried easily, not commanding attention, but inviting it. Mrs. Hawthorne was not killed in a moment of rage. She was killed because she was observant and because she trusted patterns. Over time, she noticed discrepancies in the estate accounts. Small ones, the sort many people overlook, especially when committed by someone considered reliable. Oliver Trent's name passed unspoken through the room. She understood something else as well, Miss Marple continued, that confronting such matters publicly would only drive the truth deeper into hiding. So she prepared quietly. She reviewed old documents. She asked for copies. She tested reactions. Clara's breath caught, though she said nothing. The lavender cordial, Miss Marple said gently, was suggested as a harmless tonic, a private indulgence, but it also created opportunity and intimate routine that required no witnesses. Inspector Graves nodded slowly. The poison, Miss Marple went on, was administered gradually, enough to weaken, not enough to alarm. Mrs. Hawthorne likely suspected illness at first, but on the day of the fete, she knew something more was wrong. She paused. Recognition came first, fear came later. The broken pearls had spoken of that moment, a startled movement, not a violent struggle. A hand reaching instinctively, not to fight, but to steady herself when truth struck too suddenly. She intended to confront the matter privately after the guests departed, Miss Marple said, but the knowledge that she was close, that she knew, was enough to provoke desperation. No one interrupted. Even the house itself seemed to listen. The fire, she added, was not an act of confidence but of panic. It occurred only after suspicion widened. Guilt had become frightened. Graves exhaled quietly. "You're saying the murder was not the plan?" Silence was. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And silence is far easier to maintain than confession." Daniel spoke at last. "Then my aunt never meant for this to happen." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. I believe she meant for the truth to survive her if necessary. That understanding settled gently, like something painful yet oddly comforting. Afterward, the group dispersed slowly. There were no dramatic reactions left to be had. Only contemplation remained. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple wandered alone through the garden paths of Lavender Manor. The lavender had begun to pale, its season waning, though its scent still lingered faintly on the breeze. She paused near the place where Mrs. Hawthorne had once stood addressing her guests, so composed, so certain of control. Strength, Miss Marple reflected, often masked vulnerability, and authority, when worn too long, sometimes discouraged those who might otherwise have helped. Clara Finch approached her hesitantly. "I keep wondering," she said, "if there was something I could have done differently." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "You could not have known what you were never meant to see. Responsibility lies with intention, not proximity." Clara nodded, tears welling despite herself. "She trusted me, and she was right to," Miss Marple said. As evening fell, Bramwell Green resumed its gentle rhythm once more. The pub lights glowed warmly. Doors stood open again. Children's voices drifted faintly from distant lanes. The village would heal not perfectly, but adequately. It always did. On her final morning, Miss Marple prepared to depart. Mrs. Potter insisted on seeing her off, pressing a small bundle of lavender into her hands. "For remembrance," she said. Miss Marple accepted it with a smile. "Thank you. It reminds me that even beautiful things must be handled gently." At the station, Inspector Graves arrived just as the train pulled in. "I don't think I'll ever investigate another village the same way again," he admitted. She smiled. Villages are like families. They know one another too well, and not nearly well enough. As the train began to move, Miss Marple gazed out at the receding countryside. Lavender Manor disappeared behind hedgerows and distance, leaving only memory in its wake. She reflected quietly on Mrs. Hawthorne, a woman firm in life, careful in death, whose final act had not been accusation, but preparation. Not vengeance, but faith that truth, given time, would speak for itself. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, the scent of lavender resting faintly in her lap. Human nature, she thought, was neither kind nor cruel by default. It was simply human, and understanding it patiently, attentively, remained the most powerful form of justice there was.